Here we're just.
Yep. Okay. My name is Bill Hurd, and this afternoon I'm working with John Liskey on the Wilkes Oral History Project, and we're talking with Barbara Carrier, who's listed as Moravian historian. Hi.
Hi.
You are not native to Wilkes County.
No, I'm not.
Where did you come from in your journeys to arrive here in Wilkes?
Well, I was going to say I'm a halfback because I was born in Ohio, raised in Fort Lauderdale, and I've come halfway back. So my husband was working in the Charlotte area. He was sent up here for some jobs, and we just fell in love with the place and sort of stuck.
Same as I did back in 1977.
There you are.
When I arrived in radio, and later picked up a career at Lowe's.
That's
a
great.
home improvement warehouse. Not
All
a food
right.
store.
Okay.
Now, once you arrived in Wilkes, where did you live?
Lived in Moravian Falls for about four months, and then we have been in North Wilkesboro since that time.
And you have already talked a little bit off camera about a hobby, if you will, or a desire to research the history of a place simply because you like to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you arrived here, you looked around and you actually said, well, this is Moravian Falls. Where are the Moravians?
Exactly.
And that's where your quest began, am I correct?
It's right. Mm-hmm.
Right. Did you find Moravians in Moravian Falls?
No, did not. Found a lot of different information, publications that one would say they were here and actually were at the falls, had property at the falls, and others would say no, they were not there. So I just started checking it out.
There are no active communities of Moravians in or around Moravian Falls.
No, there are not.
The pure reference to this geographical point started you on a quest to learn more about the Moravians.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's what we're here to talk about today, is the Moravians themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, who are the Moravians?
Well, the Moravians actually date back to the late 1400s with a man and a group of brothers called the Bohemian Brethren in the section of Moravia. They were at odds with the Catholic Church at the time that was fairly corrupt and had really believed that their faith should be a relationship with a relational God rather than a liturgical system where the priest had to stand in between. And of course they were standing for holy living, good character rather than what they were seeing. There obviously at that time there were wars with the Catholics, and at that time that predated the Luther's Reformation by 100 years. So they were of course persecuted. He was a historian on his own right, so he had a lot of writings that were eventually actually destroyed. But the group went into exile underground. It was resurrected pretty much through a man named John Amos Comenius, which was about 100 years after that, with the same issue. By then, of course, Luther had, done his thesis on the wall, on the door, and Protestantism was making some headways. The translation of the Bible into English actually would have been the impetus for that, because they were starting to read for themselves, what a godly life in their ideas would be.
So the original Bible that was being used in the Catholic Church at that time was written in Latin.
Yes, and
all the liturgy was in Latin.
Of course.
So
Mm-hmm.
it was truly an issue of, we are the church, you come to us
Mm-hmm.
and give us your money,
Right.
give us your attention, and we then will make
Mm-hmm.
the connection.
Right.
This was not what the Moravians had in mind. Moravia, by the way, part of Germany?
It was a little bit west of Germany, north and west, I believe. I tried to determine that on some maps. They did go from there into out of exile into what is now Germany, which was Saxony, under the auspices of a Count, Nicholas von Zinzendorf, who took them into his basically mentorship for their faith, to be propagated on his. He was also of that same type of faith, was amazed that they were so similar since it had gone back so far, because he started reading the roots of that and realized, oh my gosh, that's what I'm about. So there was at one time 800 people actually living on his estate. They actually built their own community there. And when he was sent again in exile to London for a season because of his pietistic beliefs, but also, if you can think of a feudal system, like a manorial system, where the lord of the estate has serfs under him that contribute. He was being accused of stealing people from other manors to actually beef up his estate, but it was actually a community of like I said, faith and believers of
So the community of believers were drawing folks to his estate.
Yes.
And it was not a coercion on his part.
Oh no, not at all. He was a very different man. He was, of course, raised, educated to be ruling with kings. I mean, he was in all the best universities. He, however, from the age 6, he was really involved in things of the church. His mother and his grandmother and his maiden aunt raised him into this pietistic, personal, friendly God type of religion. And from very youth, he was very much into prayer. It just was one of the unique things about the boy. When he became of age to where he was starting to learn law, he just really couldn't make the decision. I mean, I don't think they really wanted him to make the decision. He really didn't, it was one of those things that just doesn't happen. If you're going to be a ruler, you're going to be a ruler, not a preacher. It just was not compatible. But eventually he did make that decision. Things worked to where he was put in exile into London. And let me see if I can get this right. From there, they even had sitting at court all around Europe. So he was being influential on all these wealthy men who come and go to court systems like that, and was winning them to his belief as well.
So he was exiled but not in prison.
Right. He was actually built a large manor house in the Fetter Lane area of, I think it was London.
In his absence, what happened to the Moravian community on his lands?
They thrived. At one point, they thought they were going to have to leave. His wife was left in charge of the estate. By that time, there had been several droves of exiles coming out of Moravia into there. It wasn't just Moravians. There were Waldensians, there were Anabaptists, there were Lutherans that all were moving, into that same vein of spirituality.
For the same reasons that the Catholic Church, the predominant church, was not to their liking.
It would at that time have been the Protestant church. Luther had come and gone by that time. It had in turn gone to a liturgical system, where it was an educated seminarian, more educated, a religion of the mind, so to speak, where there was no relationship or a holy life, living right, character and integrity. So that you had that aspect there. It wasn't necessarily, the Catholics were still in power in some areas, but by then Protestantism had made a very good foothold.
But
and
these
there were
groups were still looking for a more direct pathway.
Yes, more
less
personal.
of an intervention.
Mm-hmm.
Don't go to God, come to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there was we've seen this throughout the ages.
Sure.
It goes all the way back to the time of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And
Exactly.
indeed. Now, there must come a point in the development of this community of believers where there was some impetus to move again, because we now must consider how they got to the Americas
Right.
to start with. So pick up the story, what happened, and how did they get here and when did they get here?
Okay, well, in just prior to the summer of 1727, the communicants that were living on what was Herrnhut in Saxony at that time, they had started getting, I like to say, think of them getting on each other's nerves. I mean, you know, it's like we have to baptize our children this way, or we don't baptize children, or we need to do the communion just like this, you know, and it just got to the point where it was about to blow apart. I mean, they were just contention. And the Count took it upon himself to visit each one of the homes, I mean, individually, and show them from Scripture what the Lord would say, you know, about living together and humbling themselves before one another. And he had set up this brotherly covenant that would state how we would live together. And the basis of that is just absolutely outstanding. You've probably heard it said before, but it was like in essentials, which would be the essential doctrines, we want unity. But in the non-essential doctrines, you know, that where the Bible's not really clear, or it's maybe said one place and, you know, it's different, you know, in non-essentials, we want liberty. But in all things, charity or love. And that was the basis of that brotherly covenant. And that was after they had put that down that he found in a library the old brotherly covenant of 1450s or 60s, and realized that it was actually a hidden seed that was come forth
Unity,
in his
liberty, charity.
In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, love. And I once had a poster on my wall it was a beautiful picture of a mountain stream with big rocks, you know, coming down. And it said, in matters of principle, stand firm like a rock. In matters of opinion, go with the flow. And that stuck with me when I saw that. I said, it sounds familiar.
I wish a contingent could go to the capital of the United States and change some minds up there.
There you are.
But then again, that's for a different interview.
Yes.
The Moravians in America.
Right. From that 1727, when that was happening, they devoted themselves to prayer, and out of that prayer and the decision to live together happily, there was a spiritual movement of the Holy Spirit. They call it the Pentecostal movement of the Moravian renewal. They call it their Pentecost, to where people just started coming to the places where they would worship, and they would just pray, or they would just read the Bible, or just, you know, just very, very in tune with their God. And it was even the young children were praying around the clock. And this is where they started a 100-year-long prayer meeting. They had like 24 people, one man and one woman. They would sign up for an hour a day, every day. And for 100 years, that prayer meeting went on from 1727 till early 1800s. I just recently found out that in 1957, the Moravian Church Modern has actually reinstituted that over all of their churches around the world. So they have someone, you know, signed up for that.
So every hour of the day or night, every day of the year, members of the Moravian Church are praying.
Right.
At this moment, there are prayers.
They are.
Are they set prayers? Are there specific themes of prayers, or is it individual welling up of hopes based upon the essentials?
They have a text that they send out that's a Bible text for every day, and it's been going on since about that year, where it has the different churches and their missionaries, mission outreaches, and they go through this. And of course, they pray for their own church bodies and stuff, but I would imagine it would depend on the church. You have in the Moravian, I'm not a Moravian, I'm a Methodist actually, but you have your high churches, your downtown churches that have a whole different flavor than perhaps one with more younger people, so you have that whole dynamic. It would have the same dynamic.
This echoes a lot of the Episcopal Church, of which I'm a member, and our Book of Common Prayer
Mhm.
which goes back hundreds and hundreds of years to
Yes.
the Anglican Church of England,
Mhm.
which provides the basis for the daily prayers.
Exactly.
And it's the Episcopalians, there are the high churches,
Mhm.
and there are the lower informal churches.
Mhm.
St. Paul's here in Wilkesboro is approximately in the center of that.
Right,
So
right.
there are some similarities here.
Yes.
And the basic tenets of the church are almost the same.
Mhm. And I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
that outpouring was the impetus to, they basically launched the first Protestant missions ever. They ended in St. Thomas Islands, they were in Africa, Greenland. Within 30 years of that, they were here. They, of course, they tried to make a mission outreach to the Indians in Georgia, and because of the war, I believe that was between the French or Spanish, but it was not possible. They did start a community, of course, you know about Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. That was a successful community. They had a philosophy that to be a missionary, you needed to earn your own living, which gave a great character, for the people you were ministering to, that yes, you need to be very good at work and not just, be lazy and stuff. So they were there, and about this time now, we've got Zinzendorf in England, and as a Methodist, I had heard that he had met some Moravians on that trip to Georgia, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, and it was basically through their fellowship with him in England that caused that great spiritual awakening in his own life. And just as my opinion, if it hadn't been for them, there might not be Methodists today. So that's just a thought. So they were now in America. At that time, you were talking about the Earl of Granville that owned a good slice of Carolina, almost to the Pacific, if the French hadn't been there.
At one point it was called the Great State
The great,
of Wilkes.
the great state of Wilkes. And he was offering land grants, the people that were pioneering the area. But he actually approached Zinzendorf to take a 100,000 acre grant and populate it, because he knew that their community in Pennsylvania was very prosperous, and our frontier badly needed artisans, cobblers, people that you don't have in the country, like, just eking a living off of the land, people who could set them up. Craftsmen, right.
The 100,000 acres, where was it located?
Okay, they came in an exploration in a area down from Pennsylvania. They came through the coast of our, Chesapeake, through the Chesapeake, and into Edenton. And at Edenton, they started coming inland towards our area until the people ran out, where there were no roads, and they hired 2 hunters. I'm thinking it might have been around Moxville, maybe a little bit further west, to help guide them to find it. When they got to just about where Alexander County is, where the Catawba River and the Yadkin River meet, they hired these hunters to lead them. They couldn't find all 100,000 acres at once in one place. They would be sparsely populated, but there would be someone had already taken it up, or it wasn't good land. And so they started thinking, well, this is not going to happen. We're just going to have to take what we can get. So they started getting 1,000 here, 5,000 there. They made a trek up through that corridor west of Taylorsville area, the little bend of the Little River, bend in the Little River, came up, got lost, thought they were on the Yadkin River, and were actually on New River. So they ended up in Blowing Rock, Boone area. In the most bitter cold winter weather, they were almost lost their lives. Their horses were almost dead, frozen. Their water froze next to their fire, on this. But they finally came down out of that, of course, found the course of the Yadkin coming back out of Boone, and found this wonderful riverbed, which is Wilkes County, basically, and took up 2 tracts in our county.
And put a time stamp on this, if you would, or a date stamp. What years are we talking about?
Okay, right now we're talking 1752. They made that first exploration through.
Okay.
At that time, Christopher Gist had been in and out of here. He was the first white settler that we can figure that was here in 1750 that we know of. In 1752, they actually surveyed those lands. When they got further east to what is now Winston-Salem, they found almost the whole 100,000 acres. And so they're thinking, okay, we don't need the rest of this.
So they gave up land further west, and they consolidated in and around what is now Winston-Salem.
Exactly. They actually, the Bishop Spangenberg, who was the head of the American Moravian Church at the time, wrote back and then went back and said, the church was in debt, partially because of Zinzendorf's building and settling again in England, the manor house. And then they did fund their first missions, so they were pretty well, not doing very well financially. And he went back and said, is there any way we can not do this? We probably aren't in a position financially to do this. And the Earl of Granville was so intent on them doing this that he basically threw in the 2 tracts in our area, also because there was more unusable land in the Winston-Salem area that they couldn't use, so it was sort of a wash. They never really intended on living here. After, of course, they got what they needed in the Winston-Salem area. And as we know, the Revolutionary War happened right as Salem was starting to really blossom as a community. And they were trying to sell the tracts here, and it got in a big muddle with the 1777 Land Confiscation Act. And that was actually in the North Carolina Supreme Court for probably close to 30 years in trying to get the thing cleared, which is interesting. I didn't know it. I ran into a copy of a dissertation of someone who had done an article or hers on William Lenore, and his interaction with the Moravians. And it appears that they won the rights to the land every time they went to the North Carolina Supreme Court, but he appealed it 7 times. But it was like the sign of the times. I mean, there was a lot of lands that were confiscated. And
we're now concentrating on Salem and the lands the Moravians had in that area, where they began to develop quite a community.
Yes.
A multifaceted community with lots of artisans. And the name Salem, what significance did it have to the Moravians?
Well, it's actually a Hebrew word for peace. It's from shalom, and it was the land of peace. They had, all through history, they had their lands confiscated, or were sent into exile, and this was to be a land of peace. I think Zinzendorf actually called it the villages of the Lord at one time in one of his communications. So it was to be that.
So this development then, Salem, began to grow.
Yes.
Talk about that, because that is what we now think of as the Moravian stronghold. Obviously, Old Salem that exists unto today, much of the original. So talk about how that developed and what went on in that area.
Well, of course, they were very well educated. They were probably didn't ingratiate themselves to some of the locals in our area because they did educate their women. They educated even the blacks. That was one of their hearts, is to reach the black community, of course, St. Thomas Island. They were living in community, of course. If you've ever visited Old Salem, it's quite a story in itself, and I highly recommend that. Their musicians, I've heard that their musicians were actually very well schooled in classical. One actually studied with Handel himself, and or Handel, I believe. But the whole community there was in a place where they didn't reach out very much to the general community because of their German language at first. Of course, they knew English, but they were trying to protect their faith, trying to protect it, probably not knowing how the land would end up being more open. And of course, Europe, or their homeland was. This part, I've only taken this as it's pertaining to the Wilkes County area, so I've got a lot on that, but I wasn't prepared to speak on that. But they did send missionaries to the backcountry. I did run across a letter where one of this actually had ministered to Rebecca Boone. Daniel Boone was in the area at the time, which was interesting, and it had some little personal notes about her in that.
Well, as Salem is developing then, these tracts here in Wilkes County are still in the holdings of the Moravian Church.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Are they being developed?
They were being developed. In 1778, the Moravian Church sold them to one man. It was a man named Montgomery, who left them to his twin daughters. And they married a Stokes and a Wellborn, and those names should be very, very familiar in this area. Yes, and there were two tracts, so one went to the one daughter's dowry and one to the other. At the time when the Revolutionary War was going on, many people staked claims on that land. Mr. Montgomery actually sold them to people during that time. There's pretty much on paper that you can go back and see whose plot was where. However, with the Confiscation Act, it was a little dicey for a while, but they did finally, in 1831, finally get it all ironed out. And those deeds were clear pretty much before that. But.
And the activity of the church in this area, the Moravian Church, how did they build their community? You said they felt somewhat, the word cloistered comes to mind. That may not be correct or otherwise, but they wanted to protect their heritage. They wanted to protect themselves. At the same time, I get the feeling that they were not antagonistic as such. They would welcome folks in.
Yes.
But they were not evangelical in the way that many other groups were trying to be all-encompassing.
Exactly.
Am I reading this correctly?
And that's right. Yes, they were not like we would think of the Amish, where they just totally stopped in time, and it was a very rigorous type of thing. They did live in community. There were strict rules, but at that time we're talking still pretty much first generation who had that fire of that revival and the party spirit on that. And the second generation would have been when things started relaxing some. They did not fight in the Revolutionary War, but they did in the Civil War, and did hold offices in the government, as they became more and more involved in the community. So it did, but from all of those communities, they did reach the Indians in the west as they followed them west with the Trail of Tears. Of course, they were very prosperous, as we can see. The original name for that territory was Wachau or Wachovia, and we know the Wachovia Bank, but it was named after the Count's homeland that looked very much like his homeland and the river that ran through it.
I knew Wachovia had a relationship, and that was one of the things I was primed to ask you as we got to that point. As the Moravians built a presence in what we now know as Wilkes County, what of that presence helped to shape the community as it was growing? And can we see things today that relate back to those times?
As soon as